Very excited to have two former television news directors here today. In the center, we have Dave Goldberg and Mike Rausch on the opposite side from me. Dave, we're going to start with you. Could you just give us a brief background on the years you spent in TV news, where you worked, and then Mike, would you do the same, please?
Sure. Well, I started in broadcasting in 1969, believe it or not, as a photographer, and it ended up in Oklahoma City, which was a wonderful experience because I competed against Bob Dodson, and we were all into good storytelling, good writing. And then went to Dallas at WFAA, and at WFAA I was responsible for photography and editing, then transitioned into news management, then transitioned from there to first news director's job in Shreveport, Louisiana. Then I was brought back to Dallas. And then from there, it was just a number of different stations across the country. In Nashville, where Mike and I worked together, wonderful station, good storytelling, quality journalism. I mean, quality journalism. And I left Nashville and went to another television station. Most of the time, I spent 16 years inside of Gillette Broadcasting, and I knew the family. I knew what their commitment was to journalism, and we can get into how it's all changed since then. But from there, I was recruited back to Nashville as corporate news director for 13 stations across the country, from Rochester, New York to Tampa, from Atlanta to San Diego, and points in between, which was a wonderful experience because our commitment to quality journalism showed in how we grew stations and ratings, and all of our stations were number one except for one station. And for whatever reason, we just couldn't get past that problem. But from there, I was recruited back to Belo in Houston, where I was a news director in Houston for 5 years. And from there, went to Dallas, then from Dallas to LA. And at that point in time, I said, I've had enough. You just couldn't do quality journalism. You couldn't do storytelling. The consultants were trying to change the world we live in, which ultimately they did. And in changing the world, I think we walked away from what good storytelling is and what content is and why content's important. And more importantly, connecting with the viewers. I don't know that anybody in television stations really make the attempt to connect the viewers any longer. I hate to go back to what used to be, but used to be you would go into the community. You'd have to prove that you were connecting. To get your license renewed, you'd have to prove that you were connecting with the community through public affairs and such. And what I find is there's such a lack of that now. I don't think most people have any understanding of what goes on in their community. Most newsrooms don't today because they don't have time. They just don't get into the community and really understand the issues. They seem to react to every issue instead of going in it and be proactive and point out the problems that affect their community. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
How about you, Mike?
I was counting them up here. I think I worked at 10 or 11 or 12 TV stations. I don't know how many. 8 news director jobs and 1 web startup in San Francisco during the internet boom. So that was kind of a different thing. But I started out as a reporter. Dave started out as a photographer. Then I moved into producer, then executive producer, assistant news director, and then news director multiple places: Rochester, New York, Louisville, Portland, Oregon, Orlando, then the internet in San Francisco, then back to Portland. Then had my own online training company for a while, and then to Mobile, Alabama, and most recently here in Colorado Springs. So I left about 1.5 years ago. So Dave was smarter than me. He got out before I did. Yeah. So that's my history.
Okay, so I got into the business at the end of 2007 and then really have not known it before the recession because it was already kind of bubbling up at the time. And the idea of moving up to a bigger market and getting to work with a photojournalist and have time was something that just went out the window. That was, you would work your way up, right? In Macon, Georgia, they'd say, you're going to go out and sweat and everything, but you'll make it to Knoxville. And when you get to Knoxville, then you'll be working with a photojournalist. And so you'll have a little bit more time to know what's going on because you won't be shooting and editing. Then I got to Knoxville, the recession happens. They're like, hey, we're going to do this thing called MMJ, multimedia journalist, where you're going to do everything. So here's your camera. Good luck. My boss saw my first story. He said, what the hell is that? Sent me to the National Press Photographers Association workshop so that I wouldn't embarrass the station anymore. I actually came to really enjoy doing that. But the problem was then I make it to Tampa. After that, I make it to Seattle. I'm now in these, like, Seattle's is kind of a network filter market, and you would never have expected, especially with the unions there, to be doing everything on your own. But sure enough, that was happening in Seattle as well. The issue was not so much that I didn't like doing that. I actually really loved putting stories together. It was just that it took so much extra time out of the day that in order to do two jobs in the same amount of time, you had to sacrifice something. I found myself often sacrificing my ability to truly understand the topics that I was covering, especially as an environmental reporter. It's very complex. I just did not have time to read the documents often that I needed to because I was driving the car. I was editing the story, especially if I had to have two due that day. So I'm curious for both of you, your experiences, you both kind of talked a little bit about this, but what do you think have been the most significant changes, say, when you started to now? And I know, Mike, you got out the most recently, but does my experience kind of jive with yours in that sense when you were watching your crews try to put their stories together? And besides that, Dave, you brought up consultants and ratings. Let's just talk a little bit about how the business has changed and what you both think have been the most significant contributions to that.
Well, the most recent history would be the workload increase on staff members, right? Because when Dave and I worked together back in the early 80s, you did a morning show, maybe a noon show, 6 o'clock news and a late news, right? But now TV stations do, a minimum of 2 hours in the morning, an hour at noon or half hour, a 4 o'clock hour show, a 5 o'clock, a 6 o'clock, and a late news. So the grinder, never stops. Newsrooms are really a information conveyor belt. It never stops. And
Right.
then with reporters being turned into MMJs, right, where they're doing the job of two, that cuts down their time. Plus their web responsibilities are significant. So you're feeding the web all day. You're feeding multiple newscasts. So it's really become a stress factory for people in newsrooms where they're not staffed as adequately as they should be or would like to be. And that's just the economics of it. It's not a negative. It just happens to be the way it is. But back when Dave and I got started, things were a lot slower moving, right? There was more time, during the day to do a story. I mean, you do one story. When I was a reporter working for Dave, I do one story for the 6 o'clock news and maybe a VO bite for the late. But the workload is substantially higher on the producers now, as well as reporters.
I should say, for people who don't know what a news director is, that you both were the top of the food chain in a newsroom, that maybe under you there's an assistant news director or a managing editor, but you're where the buck stops when it comes to the newsroom itself. Above you is the general manager that runs the entire station, right, with the marketing team and the sales team and everything. But you all are at the top of the editorial making decisions. So like when you're talking about the stresses and the time and all of that stuff, and that's related to money, you all probably knew a lot more than I did about the money issue. So, and Dave, I didn't want to cut you off if you wanted to contribute to that last question, but maybe you could also talk about, where did the money go? Why did we get rid of some of the shows that we were, I believe, syndicating, right? So now we have a 4 o'clock show or an 11 a.m. or we're going to do 1 or 2 more hours in the morning. Why did we start doing that? And where did the money all go? Because it never, for me, it was hard to see that, like, the corporation was necessarily losing money. The folks that came in to talk to us always seemed like they were doing pretty well. So I'm just curious, like, what happened there?
Well, I think, first of all, it fundamentally changed. I mean, you go back to, I'll give you an example. When I was in Houston, I had 21 reporters on staff, 21 photographers, 15 editors, and we had a morning meeting where every reporter was required to come in with 2 story ideas. In other words, it wasn't driven by, you need to go do this because of the reaction of something going on in the market. So reporters had time to do what they needed to do to produce a story. And sometimes a reporter would ask for extended time, have 2 or 3 days. That was probably a rarity in a sense, but it all changed, and it all was driven by these companies going public, because they then had to start pleasing their stockholders and in a competitive market, more with satellite and proliferation of cable, et cetera. And so they start seeing ratings decline. And when ratings start declining, they look where they have to cut. And they looked at personnel, unfortunately, in newsrooms. And when you do that, as Mike was talking about, you got a reporter who's doing shooting, editing, probably setting up their own live shot, doing 2 or 3 stories a day. And it's just gotten away from, they have to keep that money going for the stockholders. And I don't, from a ratings point of view, the ratings have significantly declined over the years. So Mike and I were talking about the other day, I guess must carry rules or something in terms of the networks paying the stations. I honestly don't know where they're getting the money today. And the newsrooms are under such tight budgets. You just don't see aggressive journalism and storytelling any longer. I mean, consultants have told you this is the way you need to do it. And I have very strong feelings about consultants, but I just think the money is everything now. I mean, money is driving everything and every decision. And I think in that sense, it's really hurt the quality of journalism.
Well, you have to keep in mind, TV stations are a business, right? And I think it was ABC those years ago when they were doing a 50% margin, right? And then so everybody thought they had to have a 50% margin. But over the years, broadcasters have, faced an awful lot of challenges, right? Ratings have been declining for decades, right? I remember I was in Portland, and we participated in a survey with Maggot as to why people weren't watching the news anymore. And it was the first time I ever heard about soccer moms, right? My daughter was really little. They didn't have time to watch anymore. But ratings have declined substantially over the years, so that's a problem. Network comp has gone away, in recent years. The networks used to pay the local stations to carry their programs. And so I think the ratings decline has been, substantial. So how do you keep making money in the same environment? Well, you keep charging more rates. The reality has been, though, that even as the ratings have declined, broadcasting has still been a good place to go because it's still where the largest audience is, even today. Even though in the next 10 years, I don't know that it's going to be there. And one thing that's holding stations up is retrans fees. They get paid by the cable systems and the satellite systems. They all have to pay the local stations by subscribers. So that's been kind of a godsend for local stations, as of late. But it's always been about ratings, right? I mean, we news directors, we live and breathe by ratings. And so, I always said if they found me dead at my desk, I'd be either looking at, the overnights or looking at my overtime sheet and how much we went over on overtime. So, it's a money thing, it's a ratings thing, but on the flip side, it's a quality journalism thing. We all tried to do journalism as best we could. When you went out and reported, Allison, you went out to do the best story that you could do that day. It's a great profession. I think it's pretty exciting, all the people you get to meet and the places you get to go and the things that you get to be a part of and the sense of contributing to the community, especially when on big stories, when, you see that everybody's watching your station. That's pretty exciting. So, there are a lot of great things about TV news. It has changed dramatically, but the economics have changed everything. You remember, years ago, I used to, criticize print reporters when they saw their business change dramatically, right? And they went through layoffs and consolidation and the newspapers went away. But over the years, they had written time after time about other businesses and industries that had gone away, that had changed, but they thought they were immune from that, right? Well, they weren't, right? And TV's not immune from that either. So what's the future going to be? Since Dave and I have been around, we've heard talk of and participated in conversations about local stations, newscasts going away completely at some point, right? So your challenge is the linear sense of TV now, right? And the appointment. I have to be there at 5 o'clock to see the story if I want to see it, right? Or I can pick up my iPhone and I can see the news I want right now. So everything's changing, and it's going to change dramatically, I think, a lot more in the next 5 years.
We covered a variety of topics, and so this time I've decided to upload the interview in short chunks. So stay tuned for more to come. Don't forget, it is Anti-Authoritarianism April, and I have demonetized all of my uploads this month. So if you want to support my work, there are links in the description for how to do that. I'll see you next time.